Can we go back to your time in Russia and you wrote Rage Against God? What was it, if you could sort of encapsulate it, about seeing enforced state atheism that impacted on that society and then on your own thinking?
By the time I went to live in Moscow in the summer of 1990, the Soviet system was dead, a knight dead in its armour, slumped on its horse. These things were over as actively pursued policies, though there was still a passive survival of quite a lot of it. The thing that I'd expected to find, which I found, was a fair amount of secret police surveillance, a collapsing economy, a general greyness and drabness which followed from that, a hideous architecture, all the things which one had learnt to associate with Soviet communism. What I hadn't realised, because I'd concentrated upon these things, was how much more important in some ways was the state's attack, particularly on the married family which had been taking place. There was, and perhaps above all, on private life and the parents' freedom to bring up their children as they wished to do, and the state taking it over. And there was a huge amount of physical evidence of this. Children had to go to nursery. Their parents could not afford to stay at home and look after them, but the economy was so arranged that you needed two incomes to live. Therefore, it was a kind of blackmail. And also there was this continued, vestigial by then, but there was a very interesting piece of evidence of it, a continued worship of a semi-mythical figure in Soviet mythology called Pavlik Morozov. And Pavlik Morozov, there's been quite a lot of scholarship on this since the collapse of the Soviet Union, was alleged by the authorities to have been murdered, I think, by his grandfather after he had denounced his parents to the authorities. And so he was made a sort of saint by the young pioneers. And there was in Moscow, in a park, a statue of this horrible child, to which the young pioneers were led in procession, and they would sing songs about how wonderful he was. They were taught to revere somebody who'd betrayed his parents to the state. And that seemed to me, the more I thought about it, to be, you could look at parts of the Soviet Union and think, well, okay, if parts of the West became very unlucky in various economic or political ways, they might look like this. But the thing which really differentiated Soviet society from the West was the worship of Pavlik Morozov. And that remains with me as the thing which I learnt while I was there, which I hadn't expected to learn, and which I now know profoundly in a way which most people don't. That statue's vanished now, by the way. I don't know where it is. I went to try and find it soon after the collapse of communism in 1991. It was gone. Most of the removed sculptures ended up in a sort of sculpture park where people could look at them. But Morozov, I know where he is.
So you wrote Rage Against God. The subtitle is How Atheism Can
Yeah, I don't like the subtitle.
You don't like it?
I was sort of cajoled into the subtitle. Publishers love subtitles, and they cause far more trouble than titles do, and they go on and on. I'm not really sure the subtitle is true.
But it caused a major rethink. You were, a young man. You were a Bolshevik.
Well, not when I was in Moscow. I wasn't a Bolshevik. No, I'd given that up long before. I was already a moral and social conservative before I went to live in the Soviet Union, and indeed before I ever went traveling in the Soviet Empire, which I began doing in the late 1970s. I'd given up Bolshevism, but I hadn't returned to Christianity till about the middle 80s. But no, it was a detailed understanding of something in practice, of something that I thought I'd understood in theory, but had inadequately understood in theory. And another characteristic of the worship of Pavlik Morozov was of course the contempt for the Christian religion. And I found this in the Russian friends that I made, often highly educated by the standards of Russia or of any country, very civilized people, often people who knew more English literature than I did, and certainly a lot more Russian literature, cultured, well-educated, attempting to be Europeans in the great tradition of European culture, but imbued from their earliest years with a scorn with the Christian religion, which they could still express. These people I liked, but it was there. It had been inculcated in them. And the Soviet Union was much more successful, it seems to me, than most people think, in stamping out Christianity. The revival of Orthodox Christianity since the collapse of the Soviet Union is, of course, a joy, but it really isn't by any means universal.
Does it tell a story that they failed to stamp it out, though?
Well, that's the question of how you would measure failure. I suspect that an empty secularism is still very much in the minds of most Russians to this day, and may well be for generations to come. I don't think you can re-establish Christian Russia as it was before 1917.
So you paint the picture in the book of, you pose the question, do we have to learn it all again towards the end? You know, having scrubbed God out of the public square, mocked him, ridiculed him, removed any influence, we then saw them move on the major institution, if you like, for the well-being of the community, the family.
Yeah.
That's what you saw.
Yeah.
So why would we want to risk that?
Well, we don't
for
believe
ourselves
that
in the West?
we don't believe that's what we're doing, do we? We think we're moving into an era of joy and liberation where people will not be confined by and repressed and restricted by foolish and outdated rules of behavior. And this suits us all because in many cases these rules of behavior are ones which get in the way of personal self-indulgence and immediate pleasure. So we don't think that. And we say, well, we've had divorce, and we've had single-parent families, and we've had increasing state intervention in the lives of children now for half a century. Civilization hasn't collapsed. What's your complaint?
Well, I go back to where I started.
Do you want us, and they say, do you really believe that the 1950s were a golden age? To which my answer is no, and I've never said so. Do you want us to go back to those days of grey misery? No, I don't. I don't want us to go. You couldn't go back anywhere if you wanted to. But that they will portray any suggestion that these social policies have been a mistake in that way, as a silly, childish nostalgia mixed with a desire to reimpose a dreary, repressive life on everybody in your side. That's how they portray it to themselves. That's how they think of people like me.
Well, to some extent, I'm almost looking for some hope or a bright light in this.
Well, don't come here for it. If you want hope, you've come to the wrong shop. I don't do temporal hope. I think the Christian civilization of the Anglosphere, particularly in my own country, is finished. I don't see any particular reason to believe it's any more likely to survive anywhere else either. But certainly in my own country, the one which I can claim to know better than others, it is done for. I think there's no reason to hope at all.
The thing that I'm driving at a little bit here, or seeking to unearth a bit, is that you do meet a lot of people who are very concerned. You do,
and I do. But you meet them because you're like that, and because you're looking for them because they're looking for you. If you just set out into the world in general, you wouldn't find them there. They're not there.
Despite the fact that the figures show this enormous level of distrust, of disengagement,
distrust
of polarisation.
Maybe, but it doesn't lead people to say, oh, well, let's in that case revive the principles of the Christian religion.
I suppose
it impels them to vote for Donald Trump or Marine LePen.
Doesn't cause them to ask questions again, though? Doesn't cause them to reflect, perhaps we are
I
headed
don't
in the wrong
think
direction?
if they do ask questions, they don't ask them of me, and if I answered them, they wouldn't like the answers. And what I do know from experience is when I attempt to answer these questions in people's minds, they reject the answers. That's why I've given up, because it seemed to me quite clear, absolutely essential for the reconstruction of civilization in the Anglosphere countries, that in all cases, actually, the ostensibly conservative political parties in them should be destroyed and replaced with genuinely conservative parties. No other arrangement could create any conceivable political hope. And when I put this forward for several years before the 2010 general election, when if the Conservative Party had lost properly, it would have been destroyed and we could have replaced it. The response I got was tribal. People preferred to stick to their tribal arrangements and to continue to vote for a party which despised them than to take any kind of radical action. what I was told in 2010 over and over again is, we've got to get Gordon Brown out. And I said, well, what does it matter whether Gordon Brown is in or out? David Cameron will be no different, realistically, in any major policy from Gordon Brown. Indeed, Gordon Brown might be a better bet. Gordon Brown is probably more hostile to European integration than David Cameron, if you're worried about that sort of thing. So it's just tribal thing. What would it matter to have 5 more years of a Labour government when, if you had a Conservative government, the actions of the government would be identical? Whereas, if you got rid of the Conservative Party, we could build something which was genuinely conservative. As I said, you can't, in Britain today, you can't sack the government. However you vote, you'll get the same government, but you can sack the opposition. And the response to this was either incomprehension or hostility or just blankness. What is for certain is it didn't make any difference. That's the point when I gave up politics. I said there's no room for reason in universal suffrage mass politics. Tribalism always trumps reason.